Richard, good morning.
Good morning. Thank you very much for inviting me back.
A pleasure, Richard. And the good news is that up till this point, we have been having you on once every 2 weeks. And before you, Paul. Unfortunately, Paul, who is a regular guest on the show as well, cannot be with us today. Paul Gallia. Paul is the person who introduced me to you, but he will return next week. But as I was saying, the good news is that you're going to be coming in once a week now, every Monday.
Indeed. We've got so much to cover between now and the end of June. So, I'm looking forward to it. And we've got a series of topics going forwards, but today we're looking at the 1930s.
Exactly, and one of the weeks, in fact, one of the Mondays, just for our listeners' benefit, I do want to tell them that we're going to dedicate it completely to the buses in Gozo, aren't we?
Correct, because the history over on the island of Gozo, when it comes to buses, is a bit different to the main island. What I've decided to do is dedicate a whole show just to looking at Gozo from the very first buses in 1925 up to the current day. So that will be, I think, in a fortnight's time.
And we're also going to go on till the end of June, as you said, once a week, and even come up to the latest news about public transport in Malta, including this latest news that you sent to me before I saw it in the newspapers. You made me aware of this new experiment that's going to be happening in Malta.
Yes, it was announced at the end of last week that there's going to be a research project involving the university here, MPT as the bus operator on the island, and Transport Malta. They're going to look at autonomous buses, so small electric minibuses that wouldn't be driven around by a driver. It would all be done automatically by computer. Trials like that are happening in a few places around the world, and it sounds as though experiments will now happen here at some point in the near future.
Now, when the news broke, of course, there were the usual jokes going around. So, does it come with will the computer have colourful language as well, just like some of the old Maltese bus drivers, etc. But in fact, they're going to be the project. Involves buses sort of going around Valletta, for example, or they're going to be restricted to one particular place. They won't be driving between towns and villages, I believe.
No, as from what I could see from the initial announcement, and sadly I don't know much more about it than what was initially announced last week, was that 4 sort of circular short routes have been identified. One of which is around the centre of Valletta, one of which is here linking the university and the hospital.
Which is not a massive distance, but still, especially for elderly people, would be very useful.
Exactly. And then there's, I think, one sort of doing a loop round to Arley, and there was a fourth one, I think up towards sort of Smart City and that thing on the north coast. Whether all 4 routes will run at the same time, or whether there will be just 1 or 2 vehicles and they'll do each individual route, I don't know at the moment. But it's certainly from my point of view of recording everything to do with buses and public transport and things, it's an interesting development, and even if nothing sort of comes of it long term, it's certainly something that I shall be recording to go into the archive for future reference.
Fantastic. And again, just before we start off with today's chapter of the history of Maltese buses and buses in Malta, which I believe is going to be about the 1930s.
Yep.
I'd just like to make a reference as well to something that you posted on Facebook, because as I said in my introduction about you, you've loved buses, but like all the whole bus system of the whole world.
Yes.
You're not confined to one country, or 2 countries, the UK and Malta. You've researched and experienced and gone around the world tracking down buses, writing about them. You founded a magazine about buses, and recently you posted about some adventures you had in Canada with some massive buses, apparently. I saw the picture. It was very impressive.
Yes, it's up on the, I think it's the Athabasca Glacier, but it's one of the big glaciers up in the Canadian Rockies. And they have these specially built massive sort of snow coaches. The tyres are almost the height of an average person, and they take you from the visitor centre actually up out onto the glacier. And it's an amazing experience. And as you say, I've travelled the world, some places more than others, but something different is always what I try and sort of go after. And obviously these snow coaches up on the Canadian glaciers certainly ticked all the boxes for being something different.
And then you obviously wrote an article about it, etc.,
yeah,
as part of your research. But again, something different that definitely applies for Malta. I think what really attracted you to the Maltese story is the different types of trucks and lorries from various countries that were adapted to become buses.
Indeed.
And then, so it's a combination of foreign technology and local art craftsmanship to make the cabins, and this is an interesting story for someone like you.
Yes, that's just it. It's a lot of it is kind of an international marriage when it comes to Maltese buses, in as much that most of the chassis over the years have been imported from overseas, whereas up until fairly recently, most of the bodies were built by very talented local craftsmen, many of whom sort of started off maybe as general carpenters and kind of sort of got into the bus industry. So yes, it's an interesting study of overseas technology and, as I say, sort of Maltese craftsmanship,
which is quite a unique thing around the world. Or up to a point?
It's up to a point. I've also been to places like Fiji and Samoa and that sort of thing in the South Pacific, and they do remind me a lot of Malta, in as much that, again, the chassis come in from overseas, the bodies tend to be locally built, and in the case of somewhere like Samoa, they're still building buses with wooden frames rather than sort of steel framework and that sort of thing. So that really does remind me a lot of sort of the way things used to be done here in Malta.
Fantastic. Richard Stedall, my guest during Campus Brunch today. He will be my guest at around 11 o'clock every Monday from now on, and we have reached the 1930s in our saga of the story of Maltese buses. So, Richard, may I leave it in your hands to take us back in time?
Sure. Okay. So, if the 1920s was the decade of rapid and mostly unregulated growth, the 1930s saw many changes of a different sort. From late 1930. No new bus licences were allowed to be issued because the number of buses on the roads had exploded up to sort of 550 or more. So the government said from that point onwards, the only new buses that could be built had to directly replace an older bus. A limited number of new private hire licences were issued during the mid-30s and the end of the 30s, so the numbers did increase slightly, but on the whole, the size of the fleet stayed relatively sort of stable. But what you did see is you still saw lots of new buses being built, partly because the technology at the time was changing quite rapidly, and you were getting larger, more sturdy chassis coming in. The rules and regulations regarding the construction of bodies here on the island changed several times during the 1930s to try and make sure that buses were much stronger construction, because a lot of what appeared very quickly in the late 1920s up to the end of 1930 must have been built very, very quickly on the cheap, because a lot of these buses only survived in use as buses for maybe 4, 5, 6 years at most. A lot of them were then converted into lorries and truck and vans and things like that, and they had sort of like a much longer second life. But yeah, the buses that came in were larger, looked different. Gone was the rounded gallery balcony at the back. Hence the reason why the 20s buses were called Tal Galleria.
Okay, perhaps there used to be a couple. We mentioned this last time in Slima.
Yes,
a local company restored a couple of 1930s.
Yeah, they were 1930s chassis, but they were made to look like 1920s. Buses and things with the rounded
thing, so people can perhaps picture that, rather than the sort of later buses that we will talk about in the future.
Yeah,
the ones that we all know, like that eventually became yellow after being green, etc. So, and they weren't very long.
No,
right?
It's a case of in the 20s, most of the buses would have seated maybe 16 people. In the early part of the 30s, you'd have been looking at maybe 20, 22 people, something like that. By the end
on two levels.
No, on just
one level.
Just one level.
Okay.
And then by the end of the 30s, there was a fixed limit of 26 passengers, although the private hire vehicles that could be hired out to groups or to do seaside runs during the summer and that sort of thing were allowed 28. But the idea was with the fixture of sort of 26 was to try and give a little bit more legroom in between the seats. And a little bit more comfort, for the seats to be a little bit more comfortable and that sort of thing. But yeah, case of it was a real kind of sort of mix, in as much that virtually all the chassis came in from overseas, but the bodies would all have been built here locally in Malta.
So there weren't actual buses being imported, but truck chassis practically were imported.
Yes. Again, back in the 30s, the difference between a chassis to be used for a van or for an open truck or for a bus, the chassis, the engines were almost identical. So if you had a Bedford from the UK, it didn't really tend to matter whether it was going to be used as a bus or a truck or a van. They tended to be, there'd maybe be some minor differences and things, but on the whole, they were the same. And I mentioned sort of Bedford there. So chassis coming in from the UK, there were over 100 Bedfords imported during the 1930s by Mamo Brothers, the dealers. Bedford was a fairly new brand name at the time. It was part of the General Motors stable from the USA. But General Motors...
So it was a British company, but owned by the American General Motors.
So what it was General Motors had owned for a while a company called Vauxhall, who produced cars and that sort of thing. And then when they started producing larger chassis in, I think it was 1931, they started using the brand name Bedford. And that up until pretty much the end of the 20th century, that name was used for all the vans, the trucks, the buses and everything that they built.
I think that name, if somebody had to write the history, not just of buses, but of car and truck and vehicle, four-wheel transport in Malta, that name would figure very, very prominently, because I think a lot of Maltese people, whether they were, for example, soldiers in the armed forces of Malta, or people who haul, furniture movers, delivery drivers, somebody would have used the Bedford at some point in their life. Even we have a famous organization called Museo in Malta, Catechism, and they would teach catechism, like religious teachings during the evenings, during the week, and on a Sunday take the boys or the girls out to the seaside in the van, in the local van, and it would inevitably very often be a Bedford. So that name is very synonymous, even here in Malta, not just in the UK where it's originally from.
That's just it. They were a very successful company at the time, and sold chassis all over the world for use in both, kind of like the freight and commercial side and the passenger side. So
the funny thing is, though, that you'd sometimes see the shape of a Bedford here in Malta, and then you'd see a picture of one in America, for example, and that's a Bedford, but in fact it's called something else, because the same design would be built in America under the General Motors banner.
Yeah.
But it would still, technically, but it would be called a Bedford here or in the UK.
Yeah. Anything that came out of the UK factory in, I think it was Luton they were based. It would have had the Bedford name, no matter where in the world it went.
Yes.
So, as I say, Bedford, during the 1930s, there were over 100 chassis imported. There were also British-built Fords, often using the Fordson name.
Fordson, okay.
And the British arm of Dodge, known as Dodge Brothers, also imported a number of chassis. But a lot of chassis in the 1930s came in from American builders, many manufacturing names of which didn't really survive much beyond the 1930s.
Interesting.
So as well as the big names of Ford and Dodge, there were also from the General Motors stable Chevrolet. Oh. And in fact, Chevrolets built in the Canadian factory, which were then exported around the world, were actually known as Maple Leaf. They were marketed as Maple Leaf. There were also some, again, mostly sort of truck chassis converted for use, using the GMC brand, which again was associated with General Motors.
Of course.
But there were a number of other names. Stewart with a W. Over 35 chassis came in the 30s from them. Imported by the dealer Mitzi Brothers of Valletta. A company called Federal supplied a similar number of chassis, and they were imported by Giuseppe Anastasi through his John Bull Ironmongery Stores company. International was an American firm, probably sort of post-war, most known for things like agricultural tractors, American school buses, trucks, and that sort of thing. But a few international chassis appeared in the 30s. A guy called Vincent Riolo from Mosta imported from the White Motor Company in America chassis bearing either the brand name White or Indiana was the other brand name that came in.
I've heard of White because they used to make vehicles for the army.
Yeah,
scout cars.
That's just it. Yeah,
yes.
they did whole sorts of things. Quite a well-known name was Willis. Now, obviously, the Willis Jeep.
Yes.
But they also, certainly in the 30s, did truck and bus chassis. And I've got a list of about 30 odd of those that are known to have come to Malta.
Do you think that the local importers, all these people that you mentioned, Mitzi's and Marmos, and would they have had a contact in America and they would have ordered these chassis, these trucks from the United States?
Yes.
And they would be shipped over, or would they have ordered them via the UK importer, and then they would they would order them via the UK?
As far as I know. They were the people we've talked about were the local franchise holders for sales. So they had, if you wanted a Federal, you had to go to Giuseppe Anastasi. You couldn't buy a Federal anywhere else.
Okay. So would Giuseppe Anastasi have written to the company in America or travelled there perhaps and made the deals face to face?
I've certainly got. There's evidence that Joseph Mamo from Mamo Brothers travelled back and forth across the Atlantic in person.
Wow! By ship in those days.
And some of the others. Joseph Shikluna of Mosta brought in over 100 Rayo chassis. The Rayo safety chassis, the Rayo Speedwagon chassis.
There was a band named after that eventually.
The band was named after the truck and bus chassis type thing.
We've got to play them now. Do go on.
And I know certainly he had a passport, so that he may well have sort of travelled overseas. But what they would have mostly done would have been sent a telegram out to out to America.
The equivalent of today's email.
Yeah, that's just it. And what would have then happened was the chassis would have been assembled in America, put on a boat. The boat almost certainly would not have sailed directly to Malta, so it might have gone via the UK, it might have gone via France, it might have gone through somewhere like Italy.
Yes, and stopped off at Malta.
Stopped off and things, but they would have then ended up in Malta.
And how would payment have been made in those days? I mean, could you wire money, I suppose?
I believe so, because obviously there were big business banks and bits and pieces here in Malta.
In Malta, of course.
Who, if they didn't have direct contacts with banks in America, would certainly have had contacts with banks in London
and then
the money. So yes, it would have been wired and
it just sounds so complicated. In those days, the world was so much bigger metaphorically. There's no internet, no sort of international. I doubt international phone calls were very hard to make, if any. And yet these people, against all odds, they just bulldozed their way and said, I want 100 jazzys, of this American brand, and because they're going to be better than my neighbors who has this brand, and they just did it. So this entrepreneurial spirit has always existed in the Maltese, hasn't it? It seems
That's it. Always an eye for business, an eye for sort of a deal and things, and there was, as I say, there was quite a bit of variety of chassis. The last two that are on the list from America, Diamond T, which again was a well-known brand at the time, and even Mack Junior. Now Mack again was for many. I think the brand name still does exist within one of the big automotive groups in America for trucks, big trucks these days and things. But they did. Even back in the 30s, they did some smaller chassis for smaller lorries and bus use and things, and they stuck the name Junior afterwards to suggest that they were smaller vehicles.
And yet they were still huge.
Yeah.
But one thing's for sure: this connection with America still exists today in the sons and daughters, and like many generations later. Yeah. There's still a group of Maltese people totally obsessed with the big American trucks, whether they're the container trucks, with the trailer trucks, or they even sort of race trucks here in Malta. And there's some very good engineers and drivers who go abroad with their trucks, massive trucks, and win races, and even become champions of Europe. And I'm sure that there has to be a connection with this birth of this sort of connection between the United States and Malta and this big trucking culture.
Yes. Well, one of the things that, at the National Archives headquarters up in Rabat, we hold the original passport applications for thousands of people. And I've been looking through some of those, looking for certain individuals that have got a direct connection with the bus industry. And in the 20s and certainly the early 30s, there were hundreds and hundreds of people went off to America, and especially Detroit, which is obviously one of the homes of the automotive industry. To work in the automotive industry. Indeed. Often doing some of the rougher jobs that maybe the local Americans didn't want to do, because a lot of these big car plants would have had their own steel plants and furnaces and everything, and it was a hard job to keep those furnaces stoked with coal and bits and pieces. And a number of sort of Maltese and Italians and that thing came in to do those jobs. But what they then did was they saved their money, and then they came back to Malta a number of years later, and they could then invest in buying a bus, buying a
So car. They brought the American culture with them, and a bunch of money as well.
Yes.
And they yes, of course. Amazing.
And in fact, we were talking, I said about, sort of Joseph Mamo of Mamo Brothers bringing in all the General Motors things. He actually went out to America very early in the 20th century, before the First World War, and worked out there doing various jobs, including just after the First World War for a number of years. He ran a bus company in California.
Wow.
So he got that experience of taking, I think it was some Ford chassis, extending them, having them built as not huge buses, again, seating maybe about 20 people,
Yeah.
and running between towns and cities in California to link into the railway. And I believe he had a fleet of maybe sort of 20, 30 vehicles starting, and he eventually sold that business up, came back to America, and founded the Mamo
came
Brothers.
Back from America, came back to Malta.
Came back to Malta in the early 20s, founded the Mamo Brothers business, and sort of got early days franchises to bring in certain makes of cars, and he eventually the big one he got was later in the 20s was the General Motors concession, and as I say, that then really business took off. And
this fellow sounds very adventurous and amazing. I mean, his story should definitely be written.
Yeah,
I wonder his descendants, whether they're aware of all this, and
they are aware.
Archives.
I was speaking only about 2 weeks ago to his to Joe Mamo's stepson, Robin, who is now 96.
Wow!
In fantastic health, and it was a real pleasure to talk to him. But he is kind of the last of that generation that remember his stepfather and things, and
living history.
Yeah, he worked with him. He worked in the Mamo Brothers business for in the 50s and the 60s and things.
But imagine the stories that the senior guy would have told Robin.
Exactly.
About his time in America.
Yeah. So it's great to be able to and that is a key part of my job, is to go out and actually talk to people
and record them
and do some recordings as well. So a lot of the recordings we tend to do in a quite an academic way. So because that's quite time consuming, and obviously because of the age of a lot of these people, the real emphasis is to go out, have maybe a couple of sort of casual chats with them and things, and really kind of sort of get to know what they know. If they've got an interesting story to tell, if they're a naturally sort of chatty person and that sort of thing, then we'll maybe look at going back and doing a recorded interview with them. And normally, obviously, if it's someone whose first language is Maltese, we'll do those interviews. I have a couple of volunteers who come out and do the interviews with me.
With you, yes, of course.
Because it's a case of from the very start, I made a point of I want these interviews to be in Maltese. Partly because that's the language that, your English is very good. I'm sure, though, you'd much prefer, if you were being interviewed in a more formal way, to be speaking Maltese.
Well, yeah.
And it's a case of, also, I want to try and capture any unique language and phrases that might have existed.
That's part of your study, isn't it?
And that's part of what we're doing. So
yes.
Now that COVID, hopefully, fingers crossed, is on its way out, we can now look at kind of sort of arranging to go out and talk to people again.
Yes.
And that's really what I'm hoping for the second half
crossed.
of this year. We can do.
We're talking about the history of public transport in Malta. We're focusing on buses. Richard, a British researcher who now lives in Malta, loves the Maltese public transport system, and he's also working with the National Archives on various projects, one of which is the oral history project, isn't it?
Yes, it's a case of part of my work is doing oral history interviews with people as part of the wider Memorja project at the National Archives. Website coming soon, watch this space.
Yes.
Right, anyway, let's crack on. In the remaining about 10 minutes, I shall try and get through as much as I can. One of the big changes that happened in the beginning of 1930s was that the government set up something called the Traffic Control Board, and part of their remit was to try and regulate the bus industry. They were set fixed routes, fixed fares, fixed timetables and things, and it was them that also introduced the famous colour-coded route liveries that existed through to the 1970s.
Oh, that a lot of people are very nostalgic.
Yes.
The older
So,
generations.
for example, the route that went to Rabat was dark blue. The route that went round to Cospicua and the Three Cities was a light green, and so on. Regulation had actually started a little bit in the 1920s. The Sliema route and St Julian's, as early as September 1922, they started to regulate what happened on the routes and things. And then in June 1927, 3 other very busy routes, Birkirkara, Cospicua and Zeebrugge, also had their timetables and fares and things fixed. The rest of the routes then happened in the spring of 1931, and that's then when the liveries were introduced as well. The one exception was that Gudja and Asha as a route wasn't really kind of sort of separated out until kind of later in the 1930s. The villages were still very small at the time.
So one bus for both.
Well, what tended to happen was either something came off the Calafrana route to operate into there, or one of the private hire buses would maybe be used to take people across to the dockyard or something like that. So it was later in the 1930s that they got...
So literally cut off unless you walked or used the horse.
Yeah, that's
Gudja and Asha.
But having said that, there were also a few routes that were separate from the very beginning, which only had often 1 or 2 buses allocated to them, and then they were quickly merged into their larger neighbours. So, for example, I've mentioned Cospicua. Well, there was actually a separate route to Senglia at the time, and again they very quickly got merged together. Ain Tafiha out to Golden Bay had 1, maybe 2 vehicles allocated to it in the beginning of the 1930s. That was very quickly merged into the much larger Malta. Put my teeth back in again. Malta and St Paul's Bay route and things, and they would have had their own liveries, but again those kind of sort of very quickly disappeared. If we look at sort of, I found some figures from October 1931 looking at how frequent routes were between Valletta and some of the villages. I've not got a full list here, but for example, I mentioned Calafrana. They'd have had a bus every 30 minutes. And what you've got to remember is, as we were discussing earlier, these buses at the start of the 30s would have only seated 20, maybe 22 people. By the end of the 30s, you're looking at, maybe sort of 26 seat capacities. Cospicua was every 15 minutes. Senglia was every 15 minutes, obviously then giving you a combined frequency round to the 3 cities of about every 7 or 8 minutes. Somewhere like Nashar would have had 6 buses in the morning, 2 buses in the afternoon, and that would have been it.
Nothing in the evening.
Nothing particularly in the evening. As the 30s went on, these timetables were built on and they became more frequent, and those places that only had, a couple of journeys in the morning peak and a couple in the afternoon got sort of full daytime services and things. So, but if you look at, sort of one of the key routes, the route to Birkirkara and Balzan, during the morning and afternoon peaks, a bus every 2 minutes, and even the off-peak period during the day, it was a bus every 5 minutes. It was a really, really busy route, and even the routes around towards sort of Sliema would have been, probably about every 5 minutes. They were actually one of the Sliema routes that stuck just to the waterfront and only went as far as the ferries before it turned around. That was actually allowed to use larger vehicles, and they had vehicles of up to 30 seats on them. But it was quite interesting at the time. The fares varied according to not only the day of the week but the time of the day as well. So you'd start off first thing in the morning with special cheap fares for workers in the morning peak. You then had for most of the day what were called ordinary fares. Later in the evening, from about sort of 8 o'clock onwards, you had what were called increased fares. And then Sundays and public holidays, you had special fares which were slightly more expensive again. And depending sort of where you went along the route as to how much, obviously, you paid. Fares were relatively cheap. They were in the old style pennies. They varied. Most of the routes would have been between a penny and 4 pennies. Longer routes, maybe up towards Memorja, would have been maybe 5 or 6 pennies. And a couple of other sort of quick financial figures I found whilst researching that. In 1932, the cost of transferring a bus from one owner to another was £5, 5 shillings.
Wow.
When you see how often vehicles were changing hands, that was a lot of money back in those days.
It was a lot of money, was it? Okay.
And 1939, the cost of an annual licence to keep a bus was £3, 3 shillings.
Oh.
So again, kind of a reasonable amount of money. So just to kind of sort of wrap things up, I've got a couple of quick appeals in case there's anybody listening. We've obviously, in this show and the previous one, been talking about the 20s and the 30s. If there's anybody who have got photographs of pre-World War II buses, I would love to hear from you, especially if they're photos that are maybe kind of in family albums that haven't been posted
published
around and things. And I would also, I think I've mentioned this before, I'd be more than happy to talk to anybody who's descended from any of the bus builders, especially those who were building buses in the 20s and 30s, but to be honest, even the post-war period. I know there are some people I've been speaking to, but there are a lot of Maltese bus builders who they're all sadly now gone mostly, but I would love to talk to any descendants, because it would be good to be able to put together some sort of biographies for the archive about these people as well.
Remind us about the websites that you're involved with and the social media pages that in fact bring together a lot of this information.
Okay, so if you want to email me, the easiest way to do it is Malta Bus Archive, all as one word, at gmail.com. The Malta Bus Archive also has quite a busy Facebook page. We've also got a YouTube channel, and normally what we do is within a couple of days of each of these shows, I upload an audio-visual version of the interview with some photographs and bits and pieces to give people an idea of what we've been talking about.
Indeed.
And as I say, coming soon, in probably sort of towards the end of June, there will be a website for the Memorja project at the National Archives, and there will be pages in that will specifically look at the Malta Bus Archive project.
But the Memorja project is actually going to be much more wide-ranging.
It's a much bigger thing. There's a number of themes combining work that had been underway at the National Archives, plus also the public memory archive work that had been done here at the university, and there's a whole host of themes and topics that will be covered by that. We're not going to sort of put everything onto the website from day one. The idea is that we'll upload a few of the themes, and then as the months go on, we'll include more and more new themes to keep people interested and coming back to the website. But
hopefully it will be launched towards the end of next month.
Yep, that's what we're hoping for.
We'll do an interview about it here on Campus FM.